Hello and welcome to today's economics podcast. Today about inflation, which is a topic we will either have just completed or we will be upcoming to. The definition, first of all, of inflation, important to get it correct, is the general increase in prices over a period of time. It's usually measured in a year. There are various ways or various things you need to remember when we're discussing how to measure inflation or how it is measured. First of all, we've got our basket of goods. So there are 700 goods in this metaphorical basket that are measured monthly in the UK. It's measured across different places in the country, and it's measured in different types of shops. Obviously, price changes in supermarkets are going to be different to corner shops, and price changes in London are going to be different to in the northeast, for example. The goods in the basket can change, so every couple of years it will be updated, things will drop out and new things will come in. So the things that we buy the most will be remain in it, so milk, bread, electricity bills, that kind of thing is always going to be there. But some other things, smartphones would obviously be in now, buying apps, and they wouldn't have been in a few years ago. The other two important things to remember about measuring inflation are that it is an index number. So remember, index numbers don't have any inherent value themselves. We take a point in time. It's usually then configured to 100, and then all subsequent years are compared to that base year. The other important thing are the weightings. So each individual item in the basket is given a weighting in terms of how important it is to how much you spend on it. So energy costs that you're going to pay more out of your monthly wages are going to have a higher weighting, i.e. more importance than things you're going to spend only a small amount on. There are two different measurements of our inflation. We've got the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, and the RPI, which is the Retail Price Index. The biggest difference is that the CPI includes housing costs or changes in housing costs. This is the measurement that's most used. It's also the measurement used in things like wage negotiations. And the Retail Price Index does include or reflect more of those housing costs. And the RPI is included or used when doing things like rail fare increases. So you might see in the new year, rail fares can go up by RPI plus or minus 1%. In terms of the types of inflation, we've got our two big and different types of inflation. Demand pull inflation, which is where aggregate demand is going to the right, and that quite often means the economy is doing well, or it might be classed as overheating. So if we have demand pull inflation, that probably means that actually the economy is more in a boom phase. People are spending money and there's not enough goods to keep up with the demand that people have. AD going right for demand pull can be caused by changes in any of the aggregate demand components. So C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If any of those change in a positive manner, that will move your AD right and cause demand pull. So it might be that income tax is cut, or as it was in the budget last week, be reflected in April. If income tax, the tax-free allowance, is increased, people have more disposable income, they'll spend more money, consumption will go up, AD will go to the right. And if there's no corresponding change in supply, then we'll end up with inflation. The other type of inflation is cost-push inflation. This would show itself on the diagram with short-run aggregate supply moving to the left. The three things that shift short-run aggregate supply are oil and raw materials, wages, and changes in indirect tax, which is VAT in this country. So at the moment, the inflation rate in the UK is 3%. It's been edging upwards ever since the Brexit vote, and that has largely been caused by short-run aggregate supply factors. The exchange rate has gone down. It's cost more to import our raw materials and oil. Therefore, firms' costs have gone up, SRAS left, and they've pushed those cost increases onto the consumers in terms of higher prices. Linked to that is the solutions. So there are various different solutions that we can have in terms of how to solve inflation. For the one we've just discussed in cost push inflation, really we're looking at supply factors. For aggregate demand and demand pull inflation, what we need to do is get demand down if the economy is overheating. So we might have contractionary fiscal or monetary policy. So in terms of fiscal policy, governments can raise tax and lower their spending to get aggregate demand downwards. The obvious downside to that is that we are then dampening demand, and all the negative consequences come with that: lower growth, higher unemployment. But that would usually be if the economy is overheating. In terms of monetary policy, which is what the Bank of England did a couple of weeks ago, increase the interest rate from 0.25% to 0.5%. That is to try and get people to save more, to make borrowing less attractive. Therefore, demand will go down and hopefully the inflation rate will go down from the Bank of England. However, it's very difficult to measure which type of inflation it is, with wage growth currently being flat or negative in real terms. It is unlikely that our current inflation rate of 3% is being caused by demand factors. It's more likely to be caused by those supply factors in terms of the exchange rate falling and raw material costs going up, and that's much harder for the Bank of England to control. The best way to solve inflation will always be through supply side policies. So your supply side policies that are trying to increase long run aggregate supply, get it to go to the right, because that way we will have lower prices and greater output. So there's not the trade-off there is with contractionary fiscal or monetary in terms of lower growth. If we're trying to control inflation with supply side policies, we get higher growth rate output levels and lower inflation. Supply side policies, however, do take time, and we've got to pick the correct ones. Supply side policies obviously would be favoured by monetarists, so they would not really believe in the use of fiscal policy to try and control it. They would always advocate supply side policies. With the Keynesians, it would obviously depend on where we are on our AS curve. So if we had run the flat bit with spare capacity, Keynesians would obviously say this is not inflation being caused by demand. There are some advantages to inflation. Already mentioned one of the not so much advantages, but we might be having inflation because aggregate demand is quite high, so the economy is doing well. So inflation might not be a bad thing if this is reflecting a strong economy where people are spending. The other main advantage of inflation is that it helps to clear debt. So government debt or private debt, if inflation is going up by 3% a year, then the debt is being decreased by 3% a year if the interest rate is not as high, which it currently isn't. So at the moment we've got a negative real interest rate, the base rate being 0.5%, inflation being at 3%, so the real interest rate obviously there is negative 2.5. Other advantages of inflation are that it's better, or some would argue it's better to have inflation or be further away from deflation. And lastly, it makes wage adjustments slightly easier, especially for governments. So nurses, public sector staff, teachers, myself included, being on a pay freeze for the last 7 years. If you've got inflation at 3%, it helps adjust wages without having to cut them. There are more or obvious disadvantages to inflation. It can cause what is a wage price spiral, which we will learn soon when we cover the Phillips curve. But if inflation is going up by 3%, then wage demands might be 3% or over, and then companies will respond by putting up their prices by more, and we end up with this spiral upwards of prices and costs. Your real income is going to go down if you've got inflation, especially if you're on a fixed income. So if your inflation rate is running at 3%, but your wages are only going up by 1%, so in the example of the public sector, real income is going down, so obviously that's going to squeeze disposable income and living standards. The value of savings is going to fall, so if you've got your money in the bank, it's only earning 1% interest. If inflation is 3%, the spending power of that money is going down every year. And the big problem, one of the big problems as well with inflation, is the uncertainty. Consumers and businesses don't like the uncertainty of the inflation rate jumping around. So historically, in the 1970s, when the UK and a lot of the rest of the world had very high inflation levels, it became very hard for businesses to plan. You would have battles with trade unions in terms of wage bargaining, and it made planning and investment very difficult. Another link to the 1970s, which is coming back slightly now, is this term of stagflation, which might be mentioned. So stagflation is where you have a stagnant growth rate. So the economy is stagnant or growing slowly. Remember, our current growth rate is 0.2 growth, but we've got inflation. So we've currently got inflation of 3%, but we've got a very low growth rate. This could be classed as stagflation, so stagnant economy but inflation, which obviously causes problems in that real earnings are dropping, but we're not compensating it with higher growth levels. It is the Bank of England's job to try and control inflation. So the Bank of England are set the target from the government. The government set a target of 2% to try and achieve. The Bank of England will use quantitative easing and more likely use the interest rate to try and control it. If the inflation rate goes to 3% or 1%, if it's 1% at either side of the 2%, has to write a letter to the Treasury, the government, to explain why and what it is doing. On the flip side of inflation, we have deflation, which is obviously the general decrease in prices over a period of time. There can be advantages to this in that it is boosting real income. So if prices are falling and your wage is the same, you will be able to afford more. Your purchasing power parity will be going up. But the two big downsides are that people delay purchases. If you think that something is going to get cheaper, especially big items, you will delay buying these, and then this becomes a spiral of people not spending money, lower growth, lower unemployment. Big problem Japan had in the 90s with that. And it also increases debt. So if prices are falling, the real value of your debt is increasing over time, which with high levels of government and private debt in this country, that would be very problematic. Over the years, the most likely types of question, when you take out all of the other stuff and simplify them, in terms of exam questions, the most likely ones are what is preferable, deflation or inflation. So is it better to have inflation in an economy or is it better to have deflation? So you would structure that with all the usual things in terms of structure, but you're essentially looking at good and bad bits about deflation, and then the opposite, good and bad bits about inflation. Another likely exam question is how you would stop or control inflation, and covered that a bit earlier. So you would look at fiscal and monetary in terms of trying to control it if it was demand side, but you have obvious downsides with that if you're going to lower growth with potentially then higher unemployment. And the one that people forget, but it is the best way to control inflation, is the use of supply side policies. And remember, when you are discussing supply side policies, we've done this in lesson, use current government supply side policies. So mobility of labour ones with HS2, the changes in the income tax allowance to give people an incentive, the increase in apprenticeships, that kind of thing. But you need to make the supply side policies specific to what is currently happening in the UK. Other two main types of question you might get are the main causes of inflation. So there you're basically looking at, is it demand side or is it supply side, so cost push? And you would look at individual reasons why demand might be going up or that the supply might be going down, to do with SRAS. And lastly, you might get a question based on basically, is inflation good or bad? So pretty easy to structure that. You go through the good sides of inflation that we've mentioned and the downsides of inflation that we've mentioned. Obviously, there'll be multiple choice questions based on inflation as well, but I think there is a very good chance also that one of the essays or data responses will be based or linked to inflation. So remember, you've got to link it to what is currently happening in the UK. We've had, since the Brexit vote, the inflation rate has been creeping up. The response has been to put the interest rate up, but has this been the correct thing to do? Is our inflation more demand pull or cost push? That will be all for today.